Kia ora whānau, kia ora tātou, ngā mihi nui, welcome, good evening, thank you for tuning in. Ko Alison Balance ahau. I'm Alison Balance and I'm your MC for tonight, and it's a delight to be here. I'm going to kick off tonight with a karakia. Tokua te wairua kia reri ki ngā taumata. Hei arahi i a tātou mahi, me te tātou whai i ngā tikanga a rātou mā. Kia mau, kia ita, kia kore ai i ngaro, kia pupuri, kia whakamoa, kia tina, tina, hui e, taiki e. Roughly translated, that means, let me just jiggle with my mouse and my computer screen, allow one's spirit to exercise its potential, to guide us in our work, as well as in our pursuit of our ancestral traditions. Take hold and preserve it. Ensure it is never lost. Hold fast, secure it, draw together, affirm. Now, while we allow a little bit of time for others to join us, we would like to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. Where are you? We'd love to know where you are coming from. You are welcome to put your answers in the chat box, which is accessed via the text bubble icon at the bottom of your screen. And that should bring up the chat panel over on the right-hand side. So the text bubble icon at the bottom of your screen, you should see the chat panel on the right-hand side. Got that? Cool. Some of you may know about Sea Week, Kaupapa Moana, some of you may not. So a bit of background. Sea Week, Kaupapa Moana is New Zealand's annual national week of celebrating the sea. And next year, 2022, it's going to take place on the 5th of March to the 13th of March. So we had it in earlier this year. We're looking forward to 2022's version. Sea Week's mission is about exciting and inspiring all New Zealanders to renew their connections with the sea, which should explain why Sea Week is hosting this webinar series that's going to fill in those 11 months between the actual March Sea Weeks. This webinar series is called Ngā Kōrero. It's designed to foster better communication about various ocean-related topics. So the series is going to highlight the diverse connections and interactions we all have with the sea. And these are the actions that make us so intertwined with the health of our ocean environment. It's an opportunity for people, for you from all over New Zealand to engage with us, to learn about our impact on the environment and the actions that we take to safeguard the ocean. There's going to be some positives about this. It's not going to be all bad news. Tonight's webinar, we are focusing on how our actions and land use practices are intertwined with the health of the sea. We'd like to say a big thanks to our longtime supporters of Sea Week, and in particular those which have made this series possible, the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO and the Live Ocean Foundation. Thank you. And thanks too to you, the audience, for being here. We are going to hear from 3 fantastic guest speakers tonight, and they are each going to share just a little bit of their vast knowledge and highlight some of the ways in which they have seen that our activities on land impact on the ocean environment. We'll hear first from Dr. Conrad Pildich from the University of Waikato. His research explores how estuaries respond to 2 of the most important land-based stresses affecting the coast, sediment and nutrients. He'll be followed by Dr. Carolyn Lundquist from NIWA and the University of Auckland, and she's going to explain how sediment affects mangroves and talk about some of the work she's done in estuarine restoration. And lastly, we have Dr. Mike Joy from the University of Victoria in Wellington to talk about some issues that he's seeing a bit upstream. He's a bit more of a stream man, and what mitigation strategies we have to address these issues. Once they've made their presentations, we will have time for lots of questions, and they will be willing and able to answer them for us. We need you to ask those questions. You can do that using the Q&A function, which is also at the bottom of your screen, just like the chat function. We will answer as many of your questions as we can after the presentations. Just to let you know, this webinar is also being recorded, and it will go up on the Sea Week YouTube channel for others to watch, or you can watch it again if you missed bits of it or just want to have another go at it. We're going to kick off with the presentations. First up, Conrad Conrad Pilditch. Sorry about that, Conrad. He's Professor of Marine Science at the University of Waikato. He lectures in marine ecology and oceanography. He's also part of the science leadership team for the Sustainable Seas Challenge and a leader on the Tipping Points project. Over to you, Conrad.
Kia ora, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be here and have an opportunity to share some of our research with New Zealand Inc. I love these opportunities and it's really great to be able to be here. So the image that you can see in front of you is the view southeast from Cloudy Bay at Titaiahu at the top of the south. And to me, it really illustrates the Te Ao Māori concept of kaitu kaitai, from the mountains to the sea, and demonstrates the interconnectedness of the land and the coastal ocean. The fact that water flows downhill is obvious, but it has profound implications for our coastal estuaries, as it directly links our activities on land to the impacts in the coastal zone. And you'll notice from Alison's introduction that we've chosen to present our talks from a sea to the mountains perspective. And this is by choice. By first understanding the impacts and the scale of this issue, it motivates the needs for the solutions and management action on land. So before I get sidetracked talking about all the research that we've done in this space, I'd like to get across three key messages that I'm going to talk about today. This is just in case I run out of time at the end. The first of these is our estuaries are valuable, productive, diverse habitats that deliver many intrinsic benefits, but also many benefits to society. That the sediment inputs from the land is a large-scale issue, and it can impact our estuaries in many different ways. And finally, we've got to realise that sediments are not the only stressor in the coastal zone, and it's these interactions with other stressors that can lead to very rapid and unexpected changes in estuarine health. So there are the take-home messages. Oh, come on. There we go. So we lose a lot of soil to the coastal ocean. New Zealand represents about 0.05% of the global land surface area, but we contribute about 2% to the global sediment budget, some 20 billion tonnes a year. So this means on a per square kilometre basis, we deliver 40 times more sediment to the coastal ocean than the global average. So, and this is illustrated quite nicely in these two images that I've presented to you here. One is an image taken, an aerial photo taken in a region just north of Wellington, after about 200 millimetres of rain fell onto an already saturated soils. The image to your right shows a satellite image several days later showing delivery of that sediment into the coastal ocean. And hopefully you can see these turbid areas, these turbid plumes emanating from these rivers with a lot of sedimentation in them. Now, New Zealand naturally delivers a lot of sediment to the coastal ocean. We're hilly, tectonically active. In the North Island, at least, we have volcanic soils that are very easily erodible. We also live in the westerly wind belt, which means we deliver a lot of rain onto our coastal and hilly environments. With a long, narrow country with very short rivers, it delivers that sediment very quickly into the coastal ocean. But our activities on land have greatly accelerated that delivery of sediment into the coastal ocean. Our current day sedimentation rates are about 10 times higher than pre-European times. And this occurs due to land use changes. When we change land use from forestry to farming, from farming to urban areas, all represent times of great sediment inputs into the coastal ocean. Now, the receiving environments of these sediments is, of course, our estuaries. Our estuaries, a lot of them are generally shallow. They're sunlit, which means that the sun can penetrate to the seabed, and they're highly productive ecosystems. The sediments contain about 90% of the plant and animal biomass in our estuaries. And just as a little calculation to demonstrate how productive our estuaries are, in a shellfish habitat, I'm thinking about cockles here, a hectare of cockles contains about 80,000 kilograms of shellfish in wet weight. A dairy farm contains, a highly productive dairy farm contains about 2,000 kilograms of cow. So on a per hectare basis, these estuaries are incredibly productive. Now, of course, these estuaries have high cultural significance, important sources of kai moana, but they also fuel food webs that exist half a world away. The migrating godwits are arriving back in our estuaries to fatten up over the summer months before leaving next fall for Alaska, where they undertake breeding. So the productivity of our estuaries helping fuel these migrations that fuel food webs half a world away. So if we think about an estuarine food web, we need to think about this in order to understand the impacts of sediments on it. A very simplified version of that is most of the production by plants is small microscopic plants called microphytobenthos, these green tinges you can see on the sediment here. They're fed upon by the benthic invertebrates, or the animals that live in the sediment, shellfish, the crabs, the worms, and the shrimp. And that's the food for the charismatic megafauna, including the godwits that we have up here. So the sediments that we're delivering into these coastal environments affect the production of these lower parts of the trophic food web. Now, one of the most obvious impacts of sorry, there's problems finding my screen. Here we go. One of the most obvious impacts of sediment arriving on the coastal zone into our estuaries are catastrophic sediment dumps. And these are obvious if there's large landslides in the catchment, and they can deliver deposits of sediment several centimetres thick onto our sand flats. It smothers the plants and the animals and disrupts the food web. These sediment dumps here can have long legacy effects, which means they can persist for a long period of time on the sand flats within these estuaries. They can break down eventually. They're broken down by the wind wave activity and the animals that come back in to colonize those sediments. But these effects can be long-lived. They're obvious. The other major impact on our estuaries is the chronic effect of elevated turbidity. This is what we observe every time we get a bit of rainfall in the catchment, this brown, turbid water arriving constantly into our estuaries and our coastal zone. Now, our research has shown that this elevated suspended sediment obviously cuts down the light. It reduces the productivity of those plants that live at the sediment water interface. With those plants no longer there doing what they do, it alters the nutrient cycling of the estuaries and actually helps fuel more macroalgal blooms or nuisance blooms. There's also a loss of shellfish as their gills clog on those suspended sediments. And in these high turbidity areas, the intertidal sand flats become a very important source of primary production because they can still function, capture sunlight, capture energy, and produce food for other animals during the low tide area. So this is the effects of the elevated turbidity, but the constant inputs of these small, fine particles into our estuaries eventually leads to muddification. It's a new word I've just made up for today's seminar. I hope you like it. And it's just a changing of our estuaries from what was sand flats that you can quite easily walk across to mud that you wade through that may be several centimetres or in some places metres deep. Now, this gradual fining or adding mud to the sediment fundamentally changes the sediment properties. It stops the exchange of oxygen and nutrients across the sediment water interface. It begins to alter the communities of animals that can occupy that habitat. And overall, the sediment becomes more resistant to erosion, more resistant to movement, and that in turn attracts more mud and begins to mudify the estuaries. We've shown through our research that as the estuaries get more muddy, the primary production in the sediments is reduced, the density and the diversity of animals living in the sediment begin to drop off, and there's loss of microbial processes that actually help get rid of excess nutrients within the system. So the impacts of sediments entering our estuaries causes the degradation long-term through this muddification. But the rate of change in the state of the estuary can be rapid and unexpected. And this is because in healthy states, there are many processes within the estuary that help keep it resilient to the inputs of sediment. So take, for example, a healthy estuary with lots of shellfish. The capacity of those shellfish to filter the water and keep it clear and remove the sediments means that the primary production in the sediments can persist. But if those shellfish suddenly get removed or get clogged with their gills, then there's an export of nutrients from the sediments into the water column, and that fuels nuisance macroalgal blooms. So the sediment and the constant inputs of these sediments begins to erode the resilience. And the other important point is the fact that the sediments are not the only stressor that are impacting our estuaries. We can think of many other activities in and around our estuaries that will also begin to erode resilience. We add nutrients from wastewater implants, wastewater treatment plants. We also alter the hydrodynamics and sedimentary nature through dredging for shipping channels and navigation. We harvest shellfish from these systems. We build seawalls to protect our infrastructure on land, which alters habitat distributions as well. And these interactions are not, stress interactions are not additive. So we have the effects of sediment on its own, we have the effects of nutrients on their own. We put those two things together, we don't get the same effect. They're often multiplicative, which means that there's highly non-linear interactions. So the interactions of these stresses have the capacity to generate change much more quickly. And of course, we're living in a warming world and a more acidified world as CO2 is being dissolved into our oceans. So our estuaries are on the receiving end of multiple stresses within these systems. Now, the nature of change within our estuaries is not linear. So as we start off in our highly pristine estuaries with healthy seagrass beds and abundant shellfish, the transition towards a modification in an estuary with low diversity and low values may not be linear, as exemplified in this little diagram here. The estuaries are resilient to change, they can absorb the stress, and then something pushes them over the cliff and past the tipping point. And that may be relatively small. It's exemplified by my little goldfish here, leaping from its small bowl into a big bowl, and that small change can obviously have catastrophic effects. So when we're thinking about sediments arriving into estuaries and the effects that it has, we also have to think about it in the context of multiple other things that are happening within our system. So although we may not be able to manage at a local scale for some of these stresses, and I'm thinking about climate change and global warming, we can think about actions that build resilience in our estuaries and make it less prone to rapid state changes or tipping points. And one way to build resilience in our estuaries is to think about actions that will reduce sediment inputs from land. Okay, that's the end of my talk. Thanks everybody for listening. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you, Conrad. That was great. I have so many questions for you later. My challenge to the speakers who follow you is how many of you can use modification in your talk? That is a great word. Depressing, but a great word. Our next speaker is Dr. Carolyn Lundquist. Carolyn is a principal scientist at NIWA in their Marine Ecology Department. She holds a joint position at the University of Auckland, and she's a professor in the Institute of Marine Science and the School of the Environment. And she is going to talk to us about her work in estuaries. Carolyn.
And have I managed to do the sharing properly? Probably not. Let me see if I've got it here.
I can see your screen.
Excellent. All right, kia ora koutou, everyone. It's my pleasure to get to talk a little bit about something that people may, I've seen a lot of names in our chat box who are in the Auckland and the Waikato regions, also up in Northland, and many of you will be probably quite familiar with mangroves. They're one of our many habitats that are quite directly impacted by sedimentation from land. And in this case, they're one of those few habitats that tends to actually like those sediments coming on. So they're very much an example of that Kiuta Kitai, or that mountains to the sea connection that Conrad introduced just before me. Let's see if it moves forward. Yes, there we go. So mangroves are one of those things that live at the land-sea boundary. I'm assuming many of you probably know a little bit, but I'm going to give a bit of a mangroves 101 for everyone. And in New Zealand, mangroves actually have quite a different reputation than they do in lots of places around the world, where people usually see mangroves as something they want and want to make sure that we're not removing them. In New Zealand, we actually have a very unusual case where our mangroves are actually increasing at quite a huge rate, certainly compared to the rest of the world where mangroves are decreasing, but often an expected rate of 3 to 4% per year. So quite a huge rate of increase. And this has resulted in a lot of interest by the public, because places that may have once been those sand flats, so many of those gorgeous pictures that Conrad was showing of these lovely sand flats, I don't think I saw any mangroves in his pictures, but a lot of these places are perceived as being taken over by mangroves. And that's resulted in many different mangrove consents for removing mangroves, political debates, even a submission to a parliamentary select committee. So lots of excitement. And this has been going on for probably about 20 or 30 years in New Zealand, where there's been some kind of real interesting publicly contested processes about mangroves. So Why are mangroves important in our estuaries? Well, mangroves live, if you see my little tip of the North Island there, that's basically where we find mangroves in New Zealand. We've only got one, which is quite unusual, and we're temperate mangroves. So we're actually one of about 2% of the mangroves that are found in temperate regions, basically not tropical. And again, those mangroves are increasing about 4% per year, and they're perceived to then be displacing other habitats. So where you have mangroves now, potentially you had sand flats or seagrass meadows or some other habitat maybe 50 years ago. And many of us remember what those other habitats were because they're right in front of where our batches, where we might have launched our tinea across a beach, etc. Now mangroves live in that intertidal zone. So they've got a fairly narrow range of area that they can live. It's basically within about 3 hours either side of when the tide is at high tide, and as sea level rises, they'll need to be going further upwards so that they've got to move as the tide goes up with climate change. So what do we actually know about mangroves? Well, back in the 80s and 90s in New Zealand, everybody assumed our mangroves had exactly the same properties as those mangroves in the tropics. Remember, New Zealand, we're temperate, we've got temperate mangroves. In theory, we live in a place where mangroves shouldn't live. They're not supposed to be able to cope with the cold temperatures at night, and usually seen as being something that's found at temperatures of 20 degrees C or more. And obviously we get quite a bit colder, certainly down here in the Waikato, we get some good frosts as well. But most of us will have heard some of these stories about the things that are very good about mangroves. So mangroves and the Boxing Day tsunami and the communities that tended to do a little bit better might have had those nature-based solutions or natural shields against tsunamis and typhoons and other coastal storm damage. We've also heard a lot in the literature about the value of mangroves as fish nurseries for birds and the other types of animals that they support. I'm a keen fan. Having my first trip to see mangroves was in Florida. I remember seeing monkeys for the first time in the wild. And so we don't have monkeys, obviously, here we are in New Zealand, but we do have a number of birds that are found in mangroves and a few fish that travel up and through them and a number of invertebrates. But we don't actually have any obligate species or species that are dependent on mangroves in New Zealand. So if we look at our Aotearoa mangroves, what do we know about them compared to mangroves in the tropics? Well, there's actually been quite a bit of work done on things like carbon sequestration. So mangroves are considered one of these blue carbon habitats. So basically habitats in the coastal zone, typically mangroves, salt marsh, seagrass, and things that basically sequester carbon out of the atmosphere and bring it in and store it in the sediments for that long-term storage. So that's one of those nice things that we actually want to happen in terms of climate change mitigation. And mangroves are known for doing that. And those numbers stack up here in New Zealand as well. We know they produce a lot of seeds and leaf litter and things so that primary productivity, they're quite productive habitats, and they contribute a lot of that to our estuary habitats. We know they work to trap sediment, and there's been quite a bit of work on that, and a little bit of work also on that role as coastal protection, so a mangrove buffer. And there is even a location out in Tauranga Harbour where one of the local landowners has planted a few rows of mangroves as a buffer against coastal erosion. So that's certainly yet another one of those things that does work for mangroves in New Zealand. On the other hand, their role in terms of bird habitats or habitats for invertebrates and for fish, it doesn't mean that these animals aren't found there. On the other hand, we don't have any obligate users or, again, things that are dependent on mangroves. And we tend not to have huge diversity, certainly, of our benthic invertebrates and things in mangroves compared to the surrounding sandflat habitats. So then over the years, we've gradually been increasing our knowledge of mangroves, but at the same time, the increase in the percent of mangroves, or that kind of huge distributional increase of mangroves, has changed also since the 1980s. Now I've got another figure that'll come up in just a second on another slide, but here this just shows we've got our 1980s, when a lot of the literature on mangroves in New Zealand and things in like NZ Geographic would have been all about mangrove conservation in New Zealand, which is quite different to a lot of the articles that we see today, and a lot of things that are going on in resource management, again, in Parliament and regional coastal plans, and a lot of that kind of what legislation do we have to look at controlling the spread or this huge expansion that we have of mangroves. So there are some of those numbers. I think that picture on the right probably shows it all. This is Whangamata Harbor. And so imagine 1944, which was probably similar to a kind of historic or pristine distribution of mangroves. That's that white bit. So then by the 1970s, we have this blue bit has taken over. So you've got white and blue is how many mangroves we've got in the 70s. And then by 2002, we more or less had kind of the current distribution of mangroves with that orange. So even more colonization, that rapid colonization, certainly between the 70s and the 2000s that we've seen throughout much of northern New Zealand. And if you look at that little line plot there, you can see that on average 3.4%, these are just in the Auckland region from one of my PhD students, but 3.4% per year on average increase in mangroves. And there are two other lines on there. One of them is 1%. That's the increase in those big, huge, tall mangroves. 20.69% increase in those short, what we like to call our hobbit mangroves. So those little dwarf mangroves, and we see quite a few of those certainly when you're driving along the motorway just over the Harbour Bridge. There's some big stands. Anyone up in Whangarei, there are quite a few near the airport as well, but lots of places where we have these very short mangroves as well that are less than a meter tall and probably aren't providing quite the same services that these tall mangroves are. So mangroves are increasing, but why? Well, here's why we're giving this talk today. It's all about sediment. So sediment deposition comes from land. We've got direct links from catchment deforestation, that sediment deposition, and Conrad explained all of this quite well. And those changes in sediment result in often muddier habitats, and mangroves love it. We also have a lot of increased deposition. So as well as mangroves increasing, we also have increases in a lot of estuaries in the amount of intertidal habitat due to the amount of mud runoff that we've got and mud coming into our estuaries. We do have some other reasons that mangroves expand. We have a lot of places where we've built infrastructure. So marinas or causeways, you can see this one here in Parihiri Inlet in Manukau Harbor. And you can see where we've basically got that motorway crossing, motorway number 1, and that whole area in that middle picture is covered or completely infilled in mangroves now. Other places where in Australia and Florida, we see a huge change where we've got increasing shoreward moving of mangroves. And in our case, we haven't really looked for that too much in New Zealand. We haven't seen it too much because we tend to see most of our shift being seaward, but it's certainly something that we'll be looking into in the near future. So what is the main type of way that mangroves expand? Well, again, we have more and more sediment coming into our estuaries. So as the sediment comes in, we're actually seeing more that infilling of estuaries and the mangroves kind of going out with the tide. So this is just kind of a pictorial of that, showing mangroves gradually moving outward and colonizing more and more of that muddier habitat. So again, not necessarily colonizing in land like we see in lots of other countries, but colonizing out to sea as the water gets shallower as more and more mud comes in. And then often we'll see this other pattern where we see just a few mangroves to begin with, and eventually we see enough seeds drop and gradual infilling of these patches. So we have these quite dense stands of mangroves where we once might have just had a few mangroves. Again, much of this is related to sediment, and then some statistics that we've done looking at a whole bunch of climate variables, land use, how much catchment is in forestation. 53.7% of the variation in mangrove expansion, this is across all our Auckland estuaries from 1940 to 2041 or 2014, can be directly explained by that catchment forested change. So how much we're removing. So if we've got all this sediment coming in, our mangroves are colonizing, well, is this something that they jump in and go zoom right away? Or is it something where there's a little bit of sediment, but we don't really see a response for about 10 years? Well, here's just one example of how quickly the mangroves can come in. This is one of our study sites with the Manukau Harbor Restoration Society, where we're looking at seedling establishment. And these are the exact same place over the course of about a year and a half. And you can see the picture on the left was one of our first times going out, and there was the odd seedling here and there. there. And by September, a year and a half later, you can see that we pretty much had the whole area infilled with seedlings. So in some locations, our mangroves can actually go quite fast. And here we were seeing mangroves growing up to 1 meter over the course of a year. So we know they can grow fast. We know the sediment's coming in and creating happy places for mangroves. But then if we're looking at controlling mangroves by removing adults, there's actually been quite a bit of this in New Zealand. And it's been quite controversial. And occasionally we do get some pretty bad results. And here are just a few of the things that we can get. I'm sorry for Tauranga that I've managed to pick a few of places here, but everything from vehicle tracking to algal blooms, to bacterial mats, to that stinky sulfide odor that we often get. And all of these can happen if you do mangrove removal in a way that doesn't promote ecological health. We've actually gone out as NIWA and also funded by Auckland Council and surveyed about 40 places where mangroves have been removed just to see, has it worked anywhere? We've seen a lot of places where it didn't work and about half a dozen where it did. And there are quite a few things that are associated with whether or not mangrove removal can be successful. Typically, it's that it's a site that has a lot of exposure so that you have a lot of wave or tidal flow. And generally it means you don't have any dispersal or ability of the, or reduced dispersal, for example, from having things like motorways or infrastructure, other things blocking the flow to the site. We've also worked with a few councils. So here's some work we've done in Whangamata. We're looking at, can we actually come up with broad scale ways of doing mangrove removal that minimize the impacts? And I think I'm particularly happy with the site. If you look at the pictures on the right, that's the same exact location. There are a couple trees that show up in the pictures that say Site G on the top and the bottom. And about after 5 years, it's really difficult to tell that this was once a site that was covered in mangroves. So we can remove mangroves without causing major impacts. That doesn't necessarily mean we should. On the other hand, we've put all of this together into coming up with what are those best practice guidelines for managing mangroves. We have sedimentation. We know we can remove seedlings successfully, but we also know seedlings come in rather quickly. We know we can and what methods work to remove adults. On the other hand, really that best practice for removing for managing mangroves is really looking at that mountains to the sea connection, key to key tie, and managing catchments and reducing that sediment load into estuaries. And if we concentrate on our efforts there, that's really the key way to managing mangroves and estuary health more generally, as Conrad spoke about. So thank you very much, and I will hand over back to Alison.
Thank you, Caroline. That was really interesting. I'm really enjoying today. Don't forget, everyone out there, the Q&A function at the bottom. If you have questions or comments, stick them in there and we'll get to them after the presentation. It's great to see some coming in. As Conrad said at the beginning, we are going from the sea up and towards the mountains. And our next speaker, Dr. Mike Joy, is going to take us up at the streams and the rivers. Mike is a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. Over to you, Mike.
Hi, kia ora everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Alison. The first two speakers have really concentrated on sediment, and I know that's a huge issue, but I'm going to introduce another one, which is nutrients, and also has big impacts on freshwater and our oceans. But my connection with the sea, if this is going to change, here we go, is Alison, you might recognize this. This is a yacht built in 1932 out of Kauri in Auckland, and that's my passion and where I spend my time when I'm not getting grumpy about the state of our rivers. And so I feel very close to the ocean, and it's the place where I go for peace. So it's important to me. But back to our rivers, and I want to talk about, you know, mountains to the sea really is the thing. And to look at the pattern of problems in our fresh water, and these will match where the estuarine and coastal areas are problems as well. Look at this map of macroinvertebrate community index, so our way of measuring the health of rivers. And you'll see the dark red areas there, which are severely polluted, and orange that are moderately polluted. And you'll see that, or for most of you will know, that is the intensively farmed and intensively peopled parts of New Zealand. And so that's where the problems are. And we have big problems in our freshwater. We have, as far as I can tell, the highest proportion of threatened freshwater fish in the world, 74% of them. Plus our only crayfish and kakahi, the freshwater mussel, are also on the threatened species list. A big chunk of our lakes are officially polluted. Pretty much all of our lowland lakes are changed from one eutrophic state to another, to a worse state. 85% of the waterways and pasture catchments exceed nitrate guideline limits, and around 60% of our rivers of the sites that we monitor on rivers are unsafe for swimming. And that's something different. That's pathogens rather than the nutrients. But if you look at all of the things that we measure as our sort of our take on water quality, and there's a couple of nitrogen measures there, ammonia nitrate and total nitrogen, the pathogens and the ecosystem health that I showed before. And you can see the pattern is almost perfectly matching across all of those water quality measures, and it's all in the intensively farmed and city parts of New Zealand. We turn fossil fuels into nitrogen fertilizer, and we put that on the land to grow plants, mostly milk. Overall, we've added 159% over the whole of New Zealand to our nitrogen loads. In places like Canterbury and Southland, it's 257%. And you can see from those red dots on the right-hand map that most of the sites in New Zealand are getting worse, not better. And the map on the left shows the areas that have exceeded the guideline limits, and you can see all of those red areas have exceeded the nitrate limits, and this is all nitrogen that will be going down to the coast. And when you compare us to the rest of the world, so when you add up the urea part of it, which is mostly what gets used in dairy farming in New Zealand, a 1,300% increase since 1990 of nitrogen fertilizer use. And it turns up in our rivers. And then if you compare us to a bunch of rivers that we found around the world, so we tried to find some of the most polluted, the Yangtze, the Yellow River in China, and you see that the Selwyn, the Ashburton and the Manawatu are right up there with the worst, then Korea, the Waikato River, and then some of the European rivers. So we really are bad on a global scale as well. And plus that nitrogen also has atmospheric effects on climate change with emissions from a nitrous oxide, which is way more of a greenhouse gas than, like 300 times more than carbon is. And when you look at the where is it all coming from, this is the latest study of water quality in New Zealand, and it says quite clearly that it's high producing pastures requiring large amounts of fertilizer. So it's intensive farming. Clearly that is the problem. And I want to just show an effect on a estuary lake here. This is Te Waihoro, just as a simple example here. But I wanted to just bring up this idea of the value of it, because I can imagine people going, but oh, dairy is so important to our economy. Here's an example of, and this is some work that Ministry for the Environment did, and ECAN Environment Canterbury, on Lake Ellesmere Te Waihoro. To stop it getting worse, they worked out how much nitrogen would have to be reduced from going into that lake. And when they worked out how much would have to be reduced by, then they did the economics on it, and it turned out that would be a loss for the farmers in that catchment of somewhere between $250 and $300 million a year. That would be their loss of revenue. And that's for farming, and 95% of that was dairy. Or you could build wetlands to soak up the nutrients, and that would cost $380 million. And I suspect that would be a lot of dairy farms that would be bought up to turn into to wetlands, because it's surrounded by dairy farms. So what the outcome was that the government and local council decided, well, we'll just do nothing. It's too expensive. We'll leave it for the future generations to have to deal with. Now, I want to make it clear that if you think hard about that, if that's $250 to $300 million that they would lose to protect that lake, then by allowing them to do that, we are subsidizing those dairy farms to the tune of $250 to $300 million per year. And I suggest to you that it would be a hell of a lot cheaper for us to pay $300 million to them to stop farming, because that would be a one-off, or to reduce the intensity down to that level. Then that would be a one-off and that's done. Because what it's costing us at the moment is $250 to $300 million every year. And all of that is going to the ocean as well. So it's just a huge harm that's being done, and the true costs are not being paid for. So when you hear that dairy is the backbone of the economy, just remember that's only when you look at one side of the equation and you ignore the other impacts on the other side. The things that in our freshwater that are very much linked to the sea are our native fish, and here's some of them here that I've done some work on over many years now. And these native fish, like I said, 74% of them are on the threatened species list, and they're very much connected to the ocean. So we only have a couple of species that are non-migratory. The rest of them require the ocean at some stage in their life cycle. So what's different about our native fish from the rest of the world? Well, most of them are benthic. That means they sit on the bottom. Nearly all of them are diadromous, and there's three types of diadromy. Diadromous means they have to have sea in the life cycle at some stage. We have catadromous or catadromy, which is the eels that go out, is an example where they spend their whole lives basically in rivers, and the last thing they do is to go out into the ocean to spawn and die. We have the opposite to that, which is anadromy, which is the smelt, or you can imagine with salmon, where they spend most of their life at sea and they come into freshwater to spawn and die. But most of our species are amphidromous. That means that the adults spend their life in the sea, but the juveniles have to go out into the ocean for about 6 months. Well, I say have to. They don't always. They can use lakes and they can use big rivers as that intermediate stage, but we really are linked to the oceans with our freshwater fish as well. They're mostly nocturnal, they're cryptic, they're not herbivorous, and they're mostly endemic. About 80% of our species are endemic and 74% are threatened. And what do they need? Well, they need water, and that's getting hard to find for them in some places, but they really need that access up and down. And so there's a bunch of things that we're doing on the land that are restricting that up and down movement. So flap gates that are put in to stop land from flooding, because we drained huge areas of New Zealand, mostly for farming, and we don't want the water coming in. And so we have flap gates to make sure the water goes out but doesn't come back in again. We have irrigation intakes, done a lot of work around Waikato on that, where huge numbers of our native fish are chewed up and chopped to pieces in irrigation pumps. We have culverts and dams that block the access to habitat for lots of them. One of the crucial life requirements for our native fish is the interstitial spaces between the rocks and the waterways, very much like what Conrad was talking about. They get filled up with sediment or mud, and then we can't have available habitat for most of those fish. So that's the really important bit. So there's a whole lot of things there, and it has huge effects on our native fish in the same way that it does on those estuarine environments as well. So what do we need to do to fix that? At the highest level, the cheapest and easiest way to protect waterways is to just not pollute them in the first place. So I don't believe in putting ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, because mostly they only take away dead things. We need to put fences at the top, and we avoid these things so we don't have to fix them up later. So I think that really crucial for the people watching tonight to realize, or to be involved and be, we have to fill in, because Department of Conservation has failed us and does not do any advocacy anymore. So it's up to us to advocate for the environment, and we have to be political, we have to be vocal, and there's no way we can hide from that. At the coalface, it's about riparian planting, removing barriers, reinstating and restoring wetlands, protecting and replanting catchments, and being the eyes for the councils, because they're very political, very politicized. They don't want to know, and we have to be out there calling them to action all the time. Obviously, the way we have to start at the top and work our way down catchments. There's no point fixing something at the bottom if you're still polluting from up the top. We need radical change in the way that we farm and produce food in this country. We've gone to this really stupid industrial model based on fossil fuels that we won't be able to do much longer. We have to move to regenerative permaculture type production, food production, but we won't achieve that while we have this completely uneven playing field. So we're like that example I gave of Te Waihoro, and I can give you 100 more of them around this country, where we subsidize, currently we subsidize harmful farming practices, which means that the good farming practices are blocked out because people just can't afford to be in the right place and to do the right things. And if we do that, if we switch to this form of farming, then we have so many advantages for everyone. The landscapes, the opportunities that come from that, the reinstating of rural communities, really sustainable food, local food, and they become great places to work. So we're not dependent on desperate workers coming from overseas to fill in these jobs on these horrible monocultures we have at the moment. These places would be beautiful places to work, and I think it would solve lots of our problems. So we really need to get on to that soon. Okay, I'll stop there so I can answer some questions.
Kia ora, thank you, Mike. That was very thought-provoking. There's a bit of comment going on in the chat. Thank you for all the questions that are coming in. It's fantastic. We're going to crack into it, and I'll direct them to various of the speakers as we go. So question number 1, which, by the way, Sarah and Nat are doing a great job in helping us by moderating the questions and making them available for me to read. So thank you for doing that. Here's a question from Zoe Q. In New Zealand, mangrove roots are often out of the water. And this is a question for Carolyn. Do you think this affects its carbon sequestration compared, say, with tropical mangroves? And do you think that the increasing distribution of mangrove habitat might affect biodiversity or carbon sequestration on a larger scale? Thoughts, Caroline?
So thanks, Alison. So one of the things I didn't mention about mangroves is most of the mangroves we actually can't see because it's underwater. So those things that you see that stick up are actually pneumatophores. So they're not the roots of the mangroves. They're actually more of a breathing tube that the mangroves use to access oxygen. And how tall they are is often relative to how deep the water gets. So in most of the places where you'll see mangroves in New Zealand, the tidal depth often doesn't get more than 20, 30, 40 centimeters deep. So our pneumatophores tend to be quite small. But I think the other interesting part about mangroves is depending on where you are, we've looked at a huge number of places, and it ranges from kind of a ratio of 1 to 1 to 1 to 8, where that 8 or that second number is the proportion of biomass that is underground. So a very large proportion of mangroves are in the roots and inside the sediments, and that's where the carbon storage really is. So looking in comparison to carbon sequestration, I think was part of the question. Carbon sequestration is comparable, probably on the low end of a lot of tropical mangroves, but certainly well within the range of what we see in a lot of the tropics in terms of how much carbon we store. And again, a lot of that, at least 50% of that storage, if not more, is actually stored in the sediments.
So there's a bit of a dilemma there about whether we want the mangroves to store the carbon or we want to get rid of them because they're making it difficult for us to launch our boats. Here's a question for Conrad from Kristen Busher. Are there any citizen science activities that students could do to monitor muddification?
That's a great question, Kristen, and it's one that I think about a little bit because a lot of the science I do tends to involve buckets and spades, which is getting outside with limited expensive equipment and trying to make sense of the natural world. So in terms of monitoring muddification, I like to use a penetrometer test, which is basically just taking a weight and dropping it from a fixed height and seeing how far it sinks into the sediment. And it's a really neat exercise you could do with the kids. If you're on a nice sand flat, the weight won't penetrate very deeply. You can measure that. If you're in a very muddy habitat, perhaps with small kids, you might not want to be there because there's health and safety issues with that. But it is actually quite a sensitive measure for how much mud is in those surface layers of the sediment. A lot of regional councils will bury plates at a depth and go back and monitor the depth down to those plates. So there are some simple things that you could do to monitor muddification. God, that's too many M's for me.
Such a good word though. Okay, this is another question for you, Conrad. When estuaries become more turbid, you talked about how nuisance one of the effects was nuisance macroalgae. So don't those nuisance macroalgae also need light? And when there's so much mud, what are they actually growing on?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alice. Again, it's sort of shifting the primary production in a normal estuary that's healthy and relatively shallow will occur at the sediment water interface. So when you add turbidity to the water column, it shifts where the plants can live to higher in the water column. So a lot of those nuisance macroalgae and nuisance phytoplankton blooms exist right at the top of the water. And often, certainly in some of our more eutrophied estuaries, and I'm thinking places like New River Estuary down in Invercargill, those macroalgae will end up high in the intertidal areas, and they receive an awful lot of sunlight at low tide when the tide is out. And then also gaining a lot of nutrients that are coming in, because often associated with those sediments is high nutrient loading as well, as Mike pointed out. And so you've got nutrients and light, and that just fuels these very different food webs, and often leads to sediments that are very anoxic, so it means no oxygen with little life, and also very muddy as well. And you would have noticed from some of Carolyn's slides, macroalgal blooms responding to the removal of mangroves with the input of organic matter and the light that's being released because the mangroves have gone from that area as well. So hopefully I answered your question there.
Now, just before I get back to the Q&A questions, I've actually just got a question for you, Carolyn. You showed us a map that had a big expansion and range of mangroves from the 1940s to today. If we go back 100 years before that, say in the 1840s, what do we know about mangrove distribution back then? And I'm just wondering if we've got a bit of a sliding baseline thing here, where are we sure that mangroves are just expanding into new territory, or are they just reclaiming territory where they used to be and somehow in the 1800s we got rid of them? Can you just clarify that for me?
An interesting question, and it certainly comes up a lot. One of the challenges is we often don't have photographs of what things look like. We do have occasionally, you can look at logbooks. So I know we've got Cook's logbooks and things like that. So we know, for example, in the Firth of Thames that he noted the mangroves up the Wairua River when he arrived in New Zealand. So that's that big river that brings a lot of the sediment in from the Firth of Thames. So in the mangroves were just within that tidal creek. There was not that big, huge, expansive stand of mangroves in that lower Firth of Thames. So that's actually quite new. Most of the places, I think the general expert feeling is that we did typically have mangroves in a lot of our tidal creeks, certainly throughout the Auckland region, and that whangamata picture, we've also got some older things where people would have had pictures of their batches 100 years ago or something, or people had drawings, and those can be used to suggest that probably in the 1940s was most often reasonably similar to what it was 200 years ago.
Interesting, thank you for that. Okay, back to the questions that are coming in from our audience. Some forestry related questions. So a question in from Teresa Battersby. How do you see the increase in exotic forestry planting affecting areas? And should we be planting native forests instead? I wonder perhaps Caroline and possibly Mike might have something to say about that.
And I think I can probably answer based on downstream. The main difference between native forest planting and pine planting is pine you're planting on a rotation, which means you're going to have in somewhere in that 15 to 20 year window, depending on the rotation, you're going to then have the pine trees removed and that sediment erosion coming on. And we've seen in a lot of places in estuaries that reasonably quickly after we've had a forestry removal, we do see sediment dumps. For example, in Whangamata, after the mangrove removal, we did have some sediment come in because the catchments were cleared due to forestry. So we had sediment coming in on the mangrove removal area that we were monitoring, but it was actually due to a completely different cause going on in the catchment.
Mike, what do you think?
Yeah,
Exotic
my
versus
answer is
native.
pretty much the same. It's it's great until you harvest and you clear fell, and then you get all that sediment impact. So it's better than not having forest, but it'd be much better to have native forest than plantation forest when it comes to looking after the freshwaters and for carbon sequestration as well.
Can I just add to that, please, Alison?
Of course you may.
I know I have colleagues who are working with industry, forestry industry in particular, and I was down in Tolaga Bay after the flood several years ago and saw the impact of the slash that had been left by forestry companies as they harvested, and the devastating effects it had on the flooding on the farmland, and also down into the estuary there as well. And there's just been some, recent negotiated space around practice in terms of much more bespoke forestry, where they look at areas prone to erosion and perhaps planting natives into those spaces that are not harvested, and then leaving the other areas that could be for exotic planting on a more high frequency rotation. But practice to date, at least from what I've seen, has been plant it all out in pine, clear it all, plant it all out again. So there are some conversations starting to happen around how they can manage at a much smaller scale within these large forestry blocks that would hopefully lead to less sedimentation. I don't know if Mike knows more about that or any of the others. It's just some stuff I've been reading lately.
Do you want to add anything at the moment, Mike?
No, that's good. Conrad's covered it. It's great.
Here's a question for you, Mike. Do fertilizers made from seaweed have a similar effect or a less dramatic effect than artificial nitrates?
The problem with artificial nitrates is just that it's cheap, and so you can greatly increase the intensity of stock on your land. If you look at that 1,300% increase in nitrogen fertilizer use, that has driven an increased stocking rate from around 1 cow per hectare up to about 4, often 3 to 4 kilograms. 1 cow per hectare to 3 to 4 cows per hectare. And so it's not the nutrient itself that's causing the problems. It's the nitrogen's coming from the cow's urine, and the urine is driven by the number of cows. The urine effects are driven by the number of cows you have per hectare. So it's an intensity issue. It's an artificially high stocking rate that's enabled through that cheap fossil-based fertilizer. So yeah, I think that there would still be an issue with seaweed-based fertilizers, but only if you carried on at the stupid intensity that we have at the moment. And as soon as we get back to much more natural levels, then natural fertilizers would have so many advantages over the fossil fuel enabled ones.
Just sticking with nitrogen for a minute, Anne Stewart Ball wonders whether there are other significant sources of nitrogen, and she wonders about industry, wastewater, other sources? Yes,
there are. So certainly from wastewater and industry, but a tiny proportion in comparison. So about 1% of the length of our waterways are in urban catchments and about 40% in pasture catchments. And where the modeling's been done on big catchments like the Manawatu River and others that have industry and farming, it's less than 5% coming from industry and people, and the rest. I think a simple kind of mind map that people can do, or just a way to understand it, is to think about the nutrient. The impacts of 1 cow is equivalent to somewhere between 14 and 44 people, depending on what you're looking at. You take a population of cattle in this country of around 10 million, multiply that by 14 people, you have equivalent of 140 million people. Compared to 5 million people. So 140 million people if you count the cows, and then versus 5. So it's a problem, but it's nowhere near as big a problem.
If I could just add to that, Alison, the other big difference too is that, and it's the same with sediments, and the runoff from the land's very diffuse. When you're looking at a wastewater treatment plant as a source of nitrogen, it's controlled and it's a point source. So in essence, the fix is at a single place, and it's much easier to implement as opposed to something that's occurring across large areas of the landscape. So the problems are quite different, and the management solutions are often much easier at the point sources than with these more diffuse sources.
Conrad, I've got a question for you that's a bit like the one I asked Caroline, and it's a baseline question to do with sediment. So I have the impression that New Zealand geologically and geomorphologically is pretty unstable, so that even before humans came along and changed the environment, New Zealand was a big producer of sediment. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. It's naturally a country that delivers a lot of sediment to the coast, but Caroline's colleagues at NIWA have done a lot of work over the last 15 to 20 years, coring in a lot of our estuaries in the North Island, but also down in the Marlborough Sounds as well. And they're able to date sediments and look at rates of accumulation, and using these compound Pacific isotopes, these kind of really sophisticated tracking tools, they're also able to go into catchments and see where most of the current sediments are being generated from. And as I mentioned in my talk, the data from multiple places and multiple estuaries indicates at least an order of magnitudes, that's a factor of 10 increase in the sedimentation rates into our estuaries since the Europeans arrived. Now, a lot of that's not linear. Obviously, there was large pulse inputs associated certainly in the North Island, when we converted kauri forests into pasture, and also when we started urbanizing Auckland. But there's still, given the current land use patterns, and you could see it in the photograph that I showed you with, those photographs from the hills around Wellington after a decent rainstorm, there's still opportunities for considerable inputs. And you just need to take a drive around the East Coast after, a substantial storm, and you'll see basically rain falling on paddocks and soil washing into the sea. That's been planted out in forestry, I think, after Cyclone Bowler. And now that forestry is just being harvested. And then we're seeing some of the effects of that land use change as we remove that first rotation of trees and then replant into it as well. So our activities have really accelerated those rates and continue to do so.
I have to agree with you. I've, in the last couple of weeks, gone over to the Horo Whenua after some rain. I've just come back from the Wairarapa after rain, and watching rivers like the Manawatu, watching the rivers and the streams flowing down to Castle Point in the last couple of days, just soup, really, just muddy soup. There's so much sediment washing off. Conrad, a question for you. You mentioned building the resilience of estuaries, and this person says, could you elaborate and give some examples on how we might do this?
So I think that there's lots of activities and things we can do that will help build resilience, and a lot of it comes down to how we manage the in estuaries activities. So we have activities on the land that are impacting our estuaries, but there's also estuaries activities within the estuary and stresses from the sea. So it would be a combination of different things. So I'll just give one simple example that how we could build resilience. So we could look after our shellfish populations within estuaries, for example. So these shellfish populations provide multiple functions within these estuaries. They help trap sediments, they help keep the water clear. And so when we're thinking about those functions that the shellfish provide, we need to think about then how we manage those shellfish populations, whether we close areas to harvest so that they can maintain those healthy shellfish beds, or we regulate the collection of them, or we start thinking about where the other stresses that are coming in, like contaminants, are coming into these estuaries. And at the moment, a lot of our estuarine management is kind of managing stresses individually. So we think about, an estuary can take so much sediment, or it can take so many nutrients. And we're having a real difficult time understanding the impacts of these interactions of these stresses. So any activity that we can begin to lessen the stress on the system through management action will help build resilience. So, yeah.
Kapai, thank you. A question for Carolyn. In many places, mangroves are trapping sediment that's released as a result of deforestation runoff things. If you remove these mangroves, then what's going to happen to the sediments? Are they going to be released out to the sea, causing even more problems? That's a question from Carola.
Thank you, Alison. So I think that was with some of the first mangrove removals at a large scale in New Zealand, that was one of the biggest worries. So if we know mangroves are associated with these muddier sediments, by removing the mangroves, are we going to create a problem somewhere else when the mud moves away? And I think I'm not sure it's necessarily a positive, but in terms of looking at the erosion of sediments in the places that this has been monitored after mangrove removals, it is a very, very slow erosion, and there were no impacts that I'm aware of where mud kind of rapidly was eroded away and moved and landed somewhere else. In Tauranga, for example, and in Whangamata, we would have looked at impacts on neighboring seagrass communities and on cockle banks, and we saw no impacts whatsoever or any changes due to sediment moving from neighboring mangroves. And often the seagrass, for example, at one of our Whangamata sites was within 5 meters of the mangrove removal and seemed to be doing quite fine and had no impacts. So I think the short of it is the mangroves, certainly they are associated with those muddier sediments, but when the mangroves are removed, it does take a very long time for those mangrove muds to disperse away.
Ka pai. Where are we at? Gosh, the questions are pouring in and we're going to run out of time. What are the urgent measures? Let's try that again. What are the urgent measures that should be taken to stop losing our kōra, our crayfish, inanga, whitebait, and our eel from the ocean life web? This feels like a question for you, Mike.
Yeah, where do I start? There are so many things, and it's pretty much so all those barriers that I talked about, the hydro dams, and this is where we get into tricky space because we want to have more green energy, which is mean there'll be more pressure to dam rivers than ever before, and that's one of the biggest impacts. Sediment, the nutrients are a big part. So, you know, making life better for the freshwater fish will happen through all of the changes that we need to do to make our farming and food production more sustainable. So we've swung crazily in this across to this industrialization model. And as we swing back, as we will have to, as we reduce our carbon footprint, then all of those things that we do will mean less pressure on our freshwaters. And I think it's really important for people to think about. It's been well studied around the world that the highest rates of biodiversity loss are in freshwaters at the moment. And that's because I think, and this is pretty much accepted, that everything that happens on the land happens first in the rivers, and then the lakes, oceans, and estuaries and oceans. And so what we see happening in our rivers is the first kind of talisman of what's going to happen in other places. So yeah, because they integrate everything that's happening on the land. So as we change our footprint on the land, it'll be better for our freshwaters.
Great, thank you. It's really interesting that the big takeaway for me from all of this is that it's a classic case of, if you're actually trying to do something down on the coast, you're being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff again. Like, where we've got to start thinking about all of this is at the tops of the mountains. And we've done a lot of landscape scale changes that are going to be very hard to undo. You provocatively, Mike, said, well, maybe we should just buy out some of the dairy farms and stop them dairy farming. There's a big question about, with the billion trees, what are the billion trees we should be planting? And should we be saying, no, you can't plant them for 20 or 30 years and then cut them down, because then you're just creating an endless cycle. It really is a mountains to the sea. It's an entire catchment approach. Can we just go around each of you in turn and just say one thing, what would be the thing that you would do first? The most, I know there isn't one single thing we can do, but what would be a good start for each of you? And I'll start with you, Mike.
Yeah, I've been writing about this recently. I think that, and I touched on it with that Lake Ellesmere example, but that would go for almost the rest of the country as well, that we have to start having a grown-up conversation about the intensity of farming in New Zealand and the harm that it's doing and what we actually gain out of it. So I think it would be money well spent to pay farmers to drastically reduce because often they're kind of caught up in this model where they've gone into it having to pay huge amounts of money for their land. And so I don't want to blame them. They're kind of the meat in the sandwich. It's not the farmers, it's the farming industry, the fertilizer companies, and Fonterra and the big dairy companies that have driven this. The only way we're going to get out of it, and it'll cost, but it's a one-off cost, and that's to cut back that intensity greatly. And if anyone thinks out there that, oh, but we're feeding the world, we are not feeding the world. Most of that milk gets dried using coal and ends up as a junk food filler in Moro bars and Twinkies and things like that all around the world. It's not feeding the world. If anything, it's making the world sick. And the other, a big chunk of it also goes to replace breast milk in poorer parts of the world. So I think that when we stop and think about what we're allowing to happen, it'll be quite a simple thing to change, to cut back on that intensity of farming, and it will have so many positive outcomes. Like I had that last slide in my talk. It'll be so good for everybody that we'll wonder, as soon as we've done it, we'll wonder why the hell we went for so long down this stupid road of industrialization.
Ka pai, thank you, Mike. Conrad, what's one thing you would do?
I guess for me, it would be a change in policy and a change towards a more interconnected way of thinking about how we need to manage the land and the sea as one. And at the moment, we have a governance structure and a policy structure that disconnects the activities on land with what the downstream effects in our estuaries are. So if there's one thing I'd like to change, it would be that we actually join up and we treat the ecosystem as a whole, as a continuum, and not separate the resource consents we're issuing on land for certain activities without thinking about those downstream effects in a much more holistic way of managing and restoring our ecosystems. And certainly in the coastal environment, I'd like to see action that leads to an upward trajectory rather than the continual downward trajectory that's facing many of our coastal environments due to this disconnect between managing on land and the effects in the coastal ocean. So, and community groups, I know there's a few of you out there, keep doing what you're doing, because those local scale actions do make a huge difference. So you may think it's small, but that little bit of riparian planting, that little bit of cleaning up the creeks and estuaries in these urban areas, you are helping the estuaries that I love to study. So don't give up on that. That's a really important component of it. Thanks.
Hurrah, thank you. And Caroline.
Cool, and thanks, Alison. Yeah, and I'd also give a huge shout out to those particularly I'm in Kirikiroa, and our gully restoration scheme in Hamilton is fantastic. And, I'm sure there are thousands of people that are working to do those active restoration projects. And it's, quite cool to see native birds come back, but then there are also those downstream effects on sediment. But I think one of the things that we're not very good about talking about is housing, and how are all these new housing developments affecting sediment. And I know there's one a bit north of Auckland that was reasonably controversial when it got approved, but I've heard stories of the amount of sediment that's coming down. Certainly, we did a lot of studies looking at sediments coming down when we had that northern motorway extension put in about 20 years ago. And we often go for infrastructure, but without really looking at what are the actual impacts of that on sediment, and could we do better? It might cost a little bit more now, but then the things that we have to do to fix it would be a lot cheaper in the long run. And we often don't consider those environmental impacts. We go for we need new houses, we need them now, and just making sure that we're reconsidering how we're doing developments. I thought I mention a really silly story, and it's silly except that it's true, but we were up in the Whangatio estuary, and we were staying at a batch, and the place next door was within kind of the sea level rise area where you weren't allowed to build, and someone had actually brought a truck in and placed an extra meter or two of sediment on so that they could build their batch next to the shore. And these things are allowed to happen, and they may amaze us, but it's not unusual. And certainly a lot of the development practices, we really need to look carefully into them and see what we can do for making sure we are building houses for all the New Zealanders who need houses, everyone who's coming back from overseas, but making sure we do it in the right way so that we're not having long-term impacts on the environment.
Kia ora, thank you. Thank you so much to tonight's speakers, to Caroline, to Mike, and to Conrad. You are fantastic. Thank you to the audience for coming along and for being so interactive. I know that I have learned lots. Don't forget, we are recording this, and if you need to go back and listen to it again, because there were a lot of numbers and a lot of information tonight, you will soon be able to do that. This is the first of a number of webinars that we're running. So if you can take a moment, please, to fill out our survey, which we just posted in the chat column. Go there, take a look, follow the link. We will also send out a follow-up email, which will have this link, because we would love to hear what you thought about our first webinar. You might have some ideas about how we can improve it for the future. Shout out to Sarah and to Nat, who have been helping behind the scenes. Sarah has been organising this. Ngā mihi nui, thank you for joining us. We're going to close with a karakia. Onohia, onohia, onohia kei te uru tapu nui, kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takatā. Koe ara e rongo, whangariaria ake kei ronga, kia tina, tina, hui e taiki e. Translated, draw on, draw on, draw on the supreme sacredness to clear, to free the heart, the body and the spirit of mankind. Rongo, suspended high above us, draw together, affirm. Good night, po Māori, catch you next time.